The illusion of power. The man who said nothing and controlled everything. There is a man, let's call him Marcus Webb, who sits at the far end of a long conference table in a glass-walled boardroom on the 42nd floor of a skyscraper in Singapore. The city sprawls below him in a glittering web of lights and highways. Inside the room, a dozen of the company's sharpest minds are locked in heated debate about a proposed merger that will reshape their entire industry. Marcus Webb says almost nothing. He does not raise his voice. He does not interrupt. He does not use his hands to cut through the air the way the other executives do when they're trying to drive a point home. He doesn't lean forward dramatically, doesn't fix anyone with a penetrating stare, doesn't do any of the things that people typically associate with power and authority and the kind of presence that commands a room. He simply listens. When the chief strategy officer lays out her case for the merger, Marcus nods. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way a seasoned judge might acknowledge a piece of evidence without revealing what he thinks of it. When the CFO fires back with a counter-argument about debt exposure and regulatory risk, Marcus pours himself a glass of water. He straightens a folder on the table in front of him. He glances once at the window. Two of the younger executives exchange a quick, barely concealed look. Is he even paying attention? Is he bored? Does he care? He cares. He is paying more attention than anyone in the room. When the argument finally exhausts itself, when both sides have said everything they planned to say and a few things they clearly hadn't, Marcus Webb sets down his glass and speaks. 4 sentences, a pause, then one more. The room goes absolutely still. Within 20 minutes the decision has been made, a decision that every person at that table will later describe as obvious, logical, and inevitable, as though it had always been heading. That way, as though the conclusion had emerged organically from the group, rather than being guided there by the quiet man at the end of the table. This is not leadership as most people picture it. There are no battle cries here, no motivational speeches, no dramatic gestures. There is no performance of authority. And yet what Marcus Webb has just done is one of the most sophisticated exercises of power in the modern world. He is what we might call a silent architect. Silent architects don't just exist in boardrooms. They are in research laboratories in Zurich, listening while 3 younger scientists argue about methodology before quietly suggesting the question that reframes the entire experiment. They are in parliamentary back offices in Nairobi, saying little during the formal sessions, but shaping the final vote through a dozen careful conversations held in corridors and over coffee. They are in negotiating rooms in Buenos Aires, appearing relaxed and almost indifferent while the other side exhausts its leverage, and then, at precisely the right moment, proposing the terms that restructure the entire deal. They are, in many cases, people you've met, people who struck you as quiet or measured, or perhaps even a little dull. People whose names you'd struggle to remember after a party, who don't dominate conversations or arrive in loud, attention-commanding ways. You underestimated them. That was exactly what they wanted. Here is the first and most important thing to understand about genuine power. It does not announce itself. This is not a matter of personality or introversion. It is not a style preference. It is a strategy, ancient, refined, and devastatingly effective. And the failure to understand it costs most people dearly. We live in a world that constantly teaches us the wrong lessons about what power looks like. We are shown the loudest voice in the room and told it belongs to the person in charge. We are shown the flashiest resume and told it represents the most capable mind. We see the most confident performance and mistake it for the most competent execution. And then we wonder why the people who seem to shout the loudest so often end up achieving the least. The philosopher Schopenhauer spent much of his career trying to answer a question that most people never think to ask. Why do intelligent people so often undermine themselves by displaying their intelligence? He observed, with characteristic bluntness, that there is something almost compulsive in the way clever people feel driven to demonstrate their cleverness, to correct others, to prove points, to win arguments. And he noted with equal bluntness that this compulsion is almost always self-defeating. Schopenhauer's mother, Johanna, herself a celebrated novelist and socialite who maintained one of Weimar's most famous literary salons, wrote him a letter when he was 19 years old that cut to the heart of this problem. She had watched her son dominate conversations and alienate guests. She had seen the way his relentless need to be recognized as the most intelligent person in the room had made people avoid him, dismiss him, and work against him even when his ideas were correct. "Your intellect," she told him, "however extraordinary it may be, is useless to the world as long as this uncontrollable need to manage and correct drives everything else into shadow." It was a devastating observation, and Schopenhauer, to his credit, spent the rest of his philosophical life wrestling with it. Not because he became humble, he didn't particularly, but because he came to understand something profound about the nature of influence. The desire to be seen as powerful is almost always the greatest obstacle to actually being powerful. Consider what happens when two people walk into a room. The first one announces his credentials immediately, drops impressive names, steers every conversation back to his own achievements, and makes sure that everyone present understands exactly how much he knows. He is performing power. He is enacting authority. He is, in the most fundamental sense, trying to convince people of something. The second person asks questions. She listens. She remembers what people tell her. She says very little, but what she says is precise, carefully chosen, and arrives at exactly the right moment to shift the entire direction of the conversation. She doesn't appear to be doing anything, and yet, by the time people leave the room, they are thinking about what she said. They are influenced by her framing. They are, in ways they might not be able to articulate, moving in the direction she indicated. Who has more power? The answer is obvious, and yet most of us, most of the time, default to the behavior of the first person. We perform when we should be perceiving. We speak when we should be absorbing. We try to be impressive when we should be trying to be useful. And we do this not because we're foolish, but because we've been trained by a culture that rewards performance, that measures worth in visibility, that confuses noise with signal. The silent architects have learned a different lesson. They have understood, whether through deliberate study, painful experience, or some combination of both, that real influence operates beneath the surface, that the most durable forms of control are invisible, and that the people who most successfully shape outcomes are almost never the ones who appear to be doing the shaping. This is the secret that Marcus Webb knows. This is the secret that Schopenhauer's mother was trying, imperfectly, to convey to her brilliant and insufferable son. This is the secret that the most effective leaders, negotiators, diplomats, and strategists throughout history have discovered, often independently and almost always the hard way. And it is the secret this book intends to explore, not as a theoretical exercise, but as a practical guide to understanding and applying the principles that govern real power in the real world. But before we can talk about how to become a silent architect, we have to understand exactly what it costs you to keep performing the way most of us do, and why the loudest voice in the room is almost always working harder than it needs to for less than it deserves. Why intelligence displayed is intelligence wasted. The paradox of the brilliant fool. In the autumn of 1987, a young economist named Rafael Solis arrived at the central bank of a mid-sized South American nation with what he was certain was a revolutionary insight about inflation management. He had spent 6 years at one of Europe's most rigorous economics programs. His doctoral dissertation had been praised by 3 separate Nobel laureates. He was 28 years old, impeccably credentialed, and absolutely convinced that the institution he'd just joined was making fundamental errors in its monetary policy that he could correct. Rafael Solis did not keep this belief to himself. Within his first month, he had written 2 internal memos outlining exactly what the bank's senior economists were doing wrong and precisely how it should be fixed. At his first departmental meeting, he corrected the deputy governor. Gently, he thought, though others in the room did not experience it that way, on a point of macroeconomic theory. At a dinner with colleagues, he explained at some length why the analytical frameworks being used by the institution were several years behind current research. He was, in almost every technical sense, correct. He lasted 14 months before being quietly reassigned to a research role with no policy influence, where he spent the next 3 years producing excellent papers that no one at the bank paid any attention to. His career eventually recovered. He is today a respected figure in international economics, but he lost nearly a decade of influence at a critical moment in his career because he made a mistake so common, so deeply human, that Schopenhauer identified it as one of the defining features of intelligent people everywhere. He could not resist demonstrating that he was right. The desire to be recognized as intelligent is one of the most powerful and destructive forces in human social life. It operates across every culture, every profession, every walk of life. It is the engine behind 1,000 career failures, 1,000 broken relationships, 1,000 missed opportunities, and it is, at its core, a profound misunderstanding of what intelligence is actually for. Intelligence is a tool. Like any tool, its value is entirely determined by how it's used. A surgeon with extraordinary technical skill who operates on the wrong patient is not displaying competence. They're demonstrating catastrophic misalignment between ability and application. Similarly, a person who is genuinely brilliant but chronically compelled to prove that brilliance to others has fundamentally confused the instrument with the outcome. They are using a scalpel to hammer nails. Schopenhauer saw this with particular clarity because he suffered from it himself. His relationship with his own extraordinary intellect was complicated and frequently painful. He knew he was one of the most rigorous philosophical minds of his era. He believed, correctly, as history has shown, that his work was profoundly important, and he spent enormous amounts of energy trying to get other people to agree with him, fighting public battles with Hegel, engineering confrontations with rival academics, demanding recognition in ways that consistently undercut the recognition he genuinely deserved. It was only later in his life, as he reflected on these patterns, that he began to articulate a different philosophy, one that drew on ancient Asian thought, particularly the Taoist concept of Wu Wei, or action through non-action. The idea that the most powerful forces in nature are often the quietest. That water, which makes no noise as it flows, carves through stone that thunder cannot crack. That the roots of an ancient tree, which grow imperceptibly and silently beneath the earth, support a structure that no storm can topple. The paradox of intelligence displayed is this: the more urgently you need others to recognize your intelligence, the less likely they are to respect it. And the less you care whether they recognize it, the more powerfully your intelligence tends to shape what they think and do. Consider the dynamics of a typical meeting in virtually any organization. There is almost always at least one person who speaks frequently, who has a comment or a question or a rebuttal for almost everything, who uses meetings as an opportunity to demonstrate their engagement, their knowledge, their value. This person is often genuinely intelligent, but what they're demonstrating, more than anything else, is anxiety, a deep need for reassurance that they belong, that they matter, that their presence is justified. Now consider the person sitting diagonally across from them. This person says very little. They ask, occasionally, a question. But the question is usually the kind that reframes the entire conversation, that makes everyone else in the room pause and reconsider something they thought they'd already settled. When they do speak at length, people lean in, not because this person is louder or more confident or more visibly in charge, but because they have trained everyone in the room, over time, to understand that when they speak, something important is about to be said. The first person is working very hard, the second person appears to be doing almost nothing, and yet the second person's influence on the outcome of that meeting, and on the dozen meetings that follow, is vastly greater. This is not about introversion versus extroversion, and it's important to be clear about that. Some of history's most effective silent architects have been naturally gregarious, warm, and socially engaging people. The quality that distinguishes them is not how much or how little they talk. It's the relationship between what they say and what they know. The silent architect never empties the tank in public. They always have more in reserve. They always hold something back, not out of deception, but out of an understanding that the appearance of depth is, in many circumstances, more valuable than any single demonstration of it. If you show everyone everything you know, you become predictable, and a predictable person cannot surprise. And a person who cannot surprise cannot truly control anything, because control, at its deepest level, is the ability to act in ways that others haven't anticipated and therefore cannot counter. Sun Tzu, writing in China more than 2,000 years ago, understood this with extraordinary precision. "All warfare is based on deception," he wrote in The Art of War. "When able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must seem inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe we are far away. When far away, we must make him believe we are near." This is not mere military cunning. It is a description of how power actually operates, not through overwhelming force, but through the management of perception. What Sun Tzu was describing is the same thing that Raphael Solis failed to grasp in that South American central bank, the same thing that Schopenhauer's mother tried to convey to her brilliant son, the same thing that Marcus Webb has mastered in his Singapore boardroom. The person who appears to have the least to prove almost always has the most power to exercise. Think about the people in your own life who have influenced you most deeply. Not the people who tried to influence you, not the ones who were constantly telling you what to think, correcting your views, explaining how you had it wrong, but the ones whose influence you felt even when you weren't in conversation with them. The teacher who asked a question that you're still turning over in your mind 20 years later. The mentor who said something brief and precise in a moment of crisis that you've returned to 1,000 times since. The colleague whose judgment you instinctively trust, not because they've proven it to you in some formal way, but because you've absorbed it over time through the consistent quality of what they say and when they say it. None of these people were, most likely, the loudest voice you've encountered. None of them were the ones most urgently trying to convince you of things. They were operating from a position of such fundamental security in their own thinking that they didn't need external validation to keep them upright. This is the quality, this internal security, this freedom from the need for constant recognition that makes genuine influence possible. And it is Schopenhauer suggests, the quality that most intelligent people spend their entire lives struggling to achieve because the intelligence itself, paradoxically, gets in the way. The smarter you are, the more aware you are of the gap between how you're perceived and how you believe you deserve to be perceived. And the more aware you are of that gap, the more desperately you want to close it. The silent architect has stopped trying to close it. They have accepted at some fundamental level that most people will never fully see what they're capable of, and they have decided, consciously or intuitively, that this is actually fine. That the gap between perception and reality is not a problem to be solved, but a resource to be deployed. Because the person who appears to have less power than they actually possess is in possession of one of the most valuable assets in any social, professional, or political environment, the element of surprise. And surprise, as we are about to discover, changes everything. The art of strategic invisibility, ancient wisdom, modern application. In the summer of 1997, a 43-year-old corporate attorney named Aiko Tanaka walked into a mediation session in Tokyo that was supposed to last 2 days and ended up lasting 11. The dispute involved a licensing agreement between a Japanese technology firm and a consortium of European partners. The numbers at stake were significant, several $100 million in potential royalties, and both sides had arrived with large, aggressive teams of lawyers, accountants, and negotiators, all of whom had extensive experience in exactly this kind of protracted, high-stakes commercial dispute. Aiko Tanaka was the quietest person in the room for the first 4 days. She asked questions, careful, specific, almost technical questions that seemed at first to be about procedural clarifications rather than substantive issues. She took detailed notes. She listened with what her colleagues described afterward as preternatural patience, sitting through hours of argument and counter-argument without visible frustration, without the small signals of discomfort that most people show when a negotiation is grinding without progress. She drank green tea. She occasionally smiled at something one of the junior lawyers said. She wrote things down. On the 5th day, she began to speak more. What emerged over the next 6 days, as Aiko Tanaka gradually, almost imperceptibly, shifted from observer to architect of the discussion, was a reframing of the entire dispute so fundamental that both sides eventually described the final settlement as something they'd arrived at together, organically, through the natural evolution of the negotiation. Neither side could have told you, after the fact, exactly when or how the direction had changed. Neither side fully recognized, in the moment, that it was being changed. The settlement, as it turned out, was structured almost exactly as Aiko Tanaka had envisioned it during those first 4 quiet days. But by the time it was agreed, everyone in the room believed they had been part of its creation. This is the art of strategic invisibility in its most refined form, and it rests on a set of principles that have been independently discovered by strategists, philosophers, and practitioners of influence across dozens of cultures and thousands of years. The first principle is patience, specifically the willingness to invest time in gathering information before attempting to act on it. This sounds obvious. It is, in practice, extraordinarily difficult because patience runs directly against the anxiety that drives most displays of intelligence. The person who feels compelled to prove their value cannot afford to seem passive. They need to be seen doing something, contributing something, making their presence felt. And so they speak before they've fully understood the situation, act before they've fully mapped the terrain, and intervene before they've identified the precise point where their intervention will have the most effect. The silent architect, by contrast, is willing to appear useless for as long as it takes to become indispensable. They understand, at a very practical level, that the information you gather by listening is usually more valuable than any impression you could create by speaking. Every person you allow to talk freely is giving you a map of their priorities, their fears, their blind spots, and their pressure points. Every argument you watch without joining is a lesson in how the people around you think and where their thinking has gaps. Every moment of apparent passivity is, from a different angle, active intelligence gathering of the most efficient kind. The Taoists captured this insight with characteristic elegance. The concept of wu wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action, is frequently misunderstood as a kind of passive withdrawal from the world. It isn't. Wu wei is better understood as the discipline of acting only at the moment when action is most effective, and refraining from action when action would be wasteful or premature. The ancient Chinese text, Tao Te Ching, puts it this way: act without acting, work without working, taste without tasting. What appears to be doing nothing is, in fact, the most precise form of doing something. The second principle is the deliberate management of what others know about you. This is subtler and more psychologically interesting. The silent architect is not a liar. They are not typically deceptive in the crude sense of saying things that aren't true. What they manage, with great care, is the incompleteness of what others understand about them. They allow, sometimes encourage, a particular version of themselves to exist in other people's minds, a version that is adequate, competent, perhaps even impressive, but that falls consistently short of their actual capability. They maintain what we might call a strategic reserve of intelligence, a reservoir of understanding, insight, and capacity that they never fully reveal to any single person or in any single situation. Why? Because the moment you show someone everything you're capable of, you've also shown them everything you can do to them. You've given them a complete map of your assets, and a person with a complete map of your assets can price you accurately, counter you effectively, and neutralize you when they choose to. The person whose true capabilities remain unclear, on the other hand, is always slightly unpredictable, slightly unknowable. And that quality of unknowability is, in the currency of social and professional power, extraordinarily valuable. It creates a kind of ambient uncertainty in the minds of the people around you, a sense that you might be capable of more than you've shown, that the resources you haven't displayed might be even more impressive than the ones you have, that underestimating you would be a mistake. The Chinese strategist concept of hiding one's true capabilities is ancient. The great military theorists of the Warring States period wrote extensively about the danger of revealing your full strength, not because strength is a liability, but because visible strength invites equal or greater countermeasures. The warrior who appears to have less strength than they actually possess can engage the enemy on their own terms, at a time and place of their choosing, rather than being forced to meet them at the point of maximum opposition. In the non-military contexts of contemporary life, this principle plays out in countless ways. The job candidate who appears eager and accomplished, but somehow leaves the interviewer feeling as though they haven't quite seen everything this person is capable of. The colleague who contributes reliably, but never quite shows all their cards at once. The leader who consistently makes decisions that seem slightly better than their stated reasoning would suggest. Decisions that feel inspired rather than merely competent, that make the people around them wonder, pleasantly, whether they're missing something. Socrates, who was doing something philosophically different from the silent architects we've been describing, but who used a similar surface technique, perfected this as a pedagogical method. He called it elenchus, and it worked by Socrates feigning ignorance, asking apparently naive questions, and drawing out from his interlocutors the ideas they held without fully examining them. Then, through patient and systematic questioning, He helped them discover the contradictions in their own thinking. He was guiding them to conclusions, sometimes devastating, sometimes revelatory, while appearing only to ask questions and express uncertainty. "The only thing I know," Socrates famously said, "is that I know nothing." This was not self-deprecation. It was a weapon, an invitation for others to overextend, to show their hand, to commit to positions that he then helped them understand were untenable. The appearance of ignorance was the most powerful intellectual tool in his entire arsenal. The third principle of strategic invisibility is what we might call the dignity of restraint. The understanding that not responding to a provocation, not accepting an invitation to compete, not taking the bait when someone tries to draw you into a demonstration of your capabilities is itself a form of power. This is perhaps the hardest principle for intelligent people to practice, because intelligent people are usually very good at winning arguments, and winning arguments feels good. It provides immediate, satisfying evidence that the intelligence is working, that the investment in all that learning and thinking and preparation is paying off. The problem is that winning an argument rarely translates into gaining influence. More often, it translates into gaining an enemy, or at least into creating in another person a mild but durable sense of resentment and diminishment that they will spend years acting on in ways neither party can easily trace back to the original moment. Mahatma Gandhi, who was, among many other things, one of the most sophisticated practitioners of strategic invisibility in modern political history, expressed this with characteristic economy: "Speak only if it improves upon the silence." This is not an instruction about communication. It is an instruction about power. Every time you speak when silence would have served better, you are transferring authority to the people around you, giving them information about your thinking, your priorities, your emotional state, your certainty and doubt. The person who speaks rarely but precisely holds their information close, releases it strategically, and maintains a position of relative opacity that the more vocal people around them can never achieve. The sports world, which has a talent for distilling complex principles of psychology and strategy into observable, real-time behavior, provides some of the clearest examples of strategic restraint in action. There is a type of athlete, found across disciplines, from long-distance running to chess to tennis to elite martial arts, who has mastered the art of appearing to perform at a level slightly below their actual ceiling. They don't coast exactly, and they aren't deliberately sandbagging in any dishonest sense. They are simply doing what is necessary at this particular stage of this particular contest while keeping something in reserve for the moment when everything depends on it. And then, at exactly that moment, they reveal a level of capability that their opponent, who has been calibrating their own performance based on what they've seen, is entirely unprepared for. The burst of speed in the final 200 meters, the precision that appears from nowhere in the deciding set, the move that ends a championship in seconds after an hour of patient, measured, seemingly conservative play. This is the art of strategic invisibility applied to athletic competition. But the principles, patience, reserve, timing, the management of perception, are identical to what Marcus Webb practices in Singapore, what Aiko Tanaka deployed in Tokyo, and what the most effective leaders, negotiators, and influencers in every arena of human endeavor have learned, one way or another, to do. The question is not whether you can see the logic of this approach. Most people can. The question is whether you can overcome the anxiety, the need for recognition, the deep social instinct to prove your worth in real time, and operate instead from that quieter, more patient, more powerful place. Schopenhauer had a phrase for what it feels like to operate there. He called it the still point of the turning world, the sense that one has found a position of such fundamental stability that the chaos and competition around you no longer threatens your equilibrium. From that still point, you can see everything. You can act precisely, and you can let others wear themselves out, performing power while you quietly, invisibly exercise it. Playing the fool, holding the throne. The psychology of strategic underestimation. Let's talk about something that makes most high achievers profoundly uncomfortable: the strategic value of appearing less capable than you are. Not incompetent, not fraudulent, not deceptively useless, but deliberately, carefully, and purposefully underrepresented, positioned in others' minds at a level slightly below your actual capability, for reasons that are entirely rational and entirely in your own interest. This is the concept that Arthur Schopenhauer spent considerable effort articulating, and that virtually every major tradition of strategic thought, from ancient Chinese military philosophy to Renaissance political theory to modern organizational psychology, has independently arrived at from a different direction. And it is, for reasons that will become clear, the concept that most intelligent people find most psychologically difficult to embrace. We can call it the strategic reserve, or we can use the more poetic formulation that the ancient Taoist texts preferred: the uncarved block, the piece of jade that could become anything because it hasn't yet committed to being one particular thing, the potential energy of a system that hasn't yet expended itself in a single direction, the power of possibility that exists only as long as you haven't completely demonstrated your limits. Here is the operational logic. Every environment you inhabit, professional, social, political, involves a continuous, often unconscious process by which the people around you assess and categorize your capabilities. This process is not malicious, and it's not even particularly deliberate. It's simply how human social cognition works. People need models of other people, simplified mental representations that tell them what to expect, what to ask for, what to compete with, and what to fear. These models are built from observation, and they're updated slowly and reluctantly, because cognitive updating is effortful and human brains prefer stability to revision. What this means, in practice, is that once people have formed a model of you, that model tends to persist, even in the face of evidence that should update it. The person who is categorized as competent but not exceptional in their first year at an organization tends to stay in that category long after they've developed genuinely exceptional capabilities, simply because the people around them have stopped actively observing them and are now running primarily off the model they built early on. The person who was categorized as brilliant but difficult in their 20s tends to carry that characterization well into their 40s, long after the edges have softened and the behavior has changed. The silent architect understands this dynamic and works with it rather than against it. If people's models of you are resistant to upward revision, then the most strategic thing you can do is to make sure those initial models are deliberately calibrated below your actual capability. Not far below. You don't want to be dismissed as irrelevant, but far enough below that the gap between the model and the reality becomes a resource you can draw on when you need it. The moment when you reveal a capability that the model didn't account for is the moment of maximum impact. It's the moment when people's assessment of you shifts, not gradually and unconsciously, but suddenly and dramatically. And sudden, dramatic reassessments of a person's capability are some of the most powerful social events in any organizational or interpersonal context. Consider the professional environment. In most workplaces, there is a subtle but pervasive competition for the status of most intelligent person in the room. This competition is largely invisible. Nobody announces they're competing for it, but it's nonetheless real and consequential. It shapes who speaks in meetings, whose ideas get credited, whose judgment gets deferred to, and ultimately whose career advances and whose stagnates. Most intelligent people participate in this competition reflexively, automatically, without realizing they're doing it. They speak to demonstrate they know things. They correct to demonstrate they know more than others. They challenge to demonstrate their thinking is sharper. And they do all of this at significant cost, because active participation in the most intelligent person competition burns social capital, creates resentment, and almost never produces the kind of durable influence that actually matters. The silent architect often appears to opt out of this competition entirely. They don't seem particularly interested in being seen as the smartest person in the room. They ask questions that suggest genuine curiosity rather than strategic self-positioning. They acknowledge uncertainty in areas where they actually have quite a lot of certainty. They let others take credit for ideas, sometimes ideas they had first, sometimes ideas they helped develop through carefully placed questions, with a generosity that seems, to the observer, simply gracious. But here is what's actually happening. By declining to compete for the most intelligent person in the room status, the silent architect has effectively disqualified themselves from a competition that carries more costs than benefits. And by allowing others to feel more capable, more insightful, and more in control than they actually are, the silent architect has done something extraordinarily useful. They have made themselves indispensable, trusted, and non-threatening all at once. People share more with those they don't feel in competition with. They ask for guidance more readily from those who don't make them feel diminished by needing it. They defer more naturally to judgment that doesn't carry the social weight of having been forcibly imposed. The person you don't feel the need to compete with or defend yourself against is the person who ends up shaping more of your thinking than anyone else, precisely because their influence arrives without the defensive resistance that would otherwise filter it out. This is what Schopenhauer meant when he wrote about the psychological art of making people feel as though they've reached a conclusion themselves. The insight they arrive at, the decision they make, the solution they implement, if they experience these as their own creation, their commitment to them is vastly deeper than if the same conclusion had been handed to them by someone else. The person who helps others discover their own best thinking without claiming credit for the help has done something far more powerful than the person who delivers brilliant answers from on high. There is a famous story, told in many versions across many cultures, about a wise teacher who could have solved a student's problem in 30 seconds, but instead asked questions for 3 hours. At the end of those 3 hours, the student believed they had solved the problem themselves. They had, in a sense. They had done the cognitive work, they had made the connections, they had articulated the solution. But the teacher had designed every question in the conversation, had known the destination before the first word was spoken, and had guided the student there through precisely calibrated inquiry rather than direct instruction. The student's ownership of the solution was complete. The teacher's influence was invisible but total. This is the apogee of the art. But we should be honest about something. This approach is not without its difficulties and its costs. The person who consistently allows others to take credit, who habitually positions themselves below their actual capability, who makes a discipline of not being seen, this person sometimes gets genuinely overlooked. There are environments in which the silent architect's approach is simply too subtle, where the cultural norms demand visible performance and visible assertiveness, where the quiet person gets passed over not because they lack power, but because the people making decisions can't see it. There are also personal costs. The discipline of restraint, particularly for people with genuinely high capabilities, can feel like a kind of suppression. There is something that wants to be seen, that wants to be recognized, that wants the work and the intelligence and the effort to be acknowledged. The silent architect manages this want, channels it, sometimes suppresses it in service of the larger strategy. But it doesn't go away, and there are moments, usually moments of exhaustion or frustration, when the impulse to simply demonstrate, once and for all, what they're actually capable of becomes nearly irresistible. The philosophy that sustains them through those moments is, at its core, a form of long-game thinking. Every act of restraint is an investment. Every credit given away is a relationship deepened. Every moment of apparent smallness is a reserve of surprise being built. The question is never, what impression will I make right now? But always, what position will I be in 6 months or 2 years from now because of the choices I'm making today? Schopenhauer, who was never particularly good at practicing what he preached in this domain, nevertheless articulated the principle with considerable clarity. He noted that the people who are most obsessed with what others think of them are almost always the people with the least actual control over what others think of them, and the people who seem most indifferent to external evaluation are almost always the people whose external evaluations end up being the most favorable. This is one of those counterintuitive principles that seems paradoxical until you've seen it operate, at which point it seems entirely obvious. The person who needs your good opinion most is the person who most makes you withhold it. The person who seems not to need your good opinion at all is the person who most effortlessly receives it. This is not a cynical manipulation of social dynamics. It's a description of how human psychology actually works. And the silent architect, whether through study or experience or temperament, has learned to work with it rather than against it. Let's return to a concrete example. Elena Vasquez is a senior policy advisor in a government ministry in Helsinki. She has worked in the ministry for 18 years. She is deeply competent, widely read, and has strong opinions on virtually every issue that crosses her desk. Her minister, whom she has served for the last 4 years, is a capable politician who is considerably less expert in the policy details than Elena, but considerably more skilled at the political dimensions of the job. This is, in government, a perfectly ordinary arrangement. What makes Elena unusual is how she handles the inherent tension in this arrangement. When the minister makes a decision that Elena thinks is wrong, based on political considerations rather than policy analysis, she doesn't argue directly. She doesn't produce a memo outlining why the minister is mistaken. She doesn't bring in outside experts to support her position. Instead, she does something that has made her one of the most quietly influential people in the entire ministry. She asks questions. Careful, apparently innocent, genuinely curious questions, posed at moments that she has learned over 18 years, are the moments when the minister is most open to new information. I was thinking about what happened in Sweden in 2019 when they tried something similar, Elena might say. Do you remember how that played out? The minister doesn't remember, and Elena explains, briefly, factually, without any implication that the current situation is obviously parallel or that the minister should obviously draw a particular conclusion. But the information is now in the minister's mind. The parallel is now active, and several days later, when the minister arrives at a modified version of the policy that incorporates the lesson Elena was trying to convey, the minister believes, entirely genuinely, that they reached this conclusion through their own reflection. Elena has played the fool and held the throne. Becoming a silent architect, the practice of invisible power in everyday life. Everything we've explored in the previous 4 sections comes down to a set of principles that are, individually, straightforward, and that are, collectively, a complete reorientation of how most people approach power, influence, and the management of their own intelligence in social and professional settings. Let's be practical. The first principle and in some ways the most foundational, is what we might call the discipline of strategic listening. This is not the same as being quiet. It is not the same as letting others dominate a conversation while you sit in polite silence. Strategic listening is an active, demanding, highly skilled practice that requires enormous attention, genuine curiosity, and the discipline to resist the constant pull toward speaking. Here is what strategic listening actually involves. It involves asking yourself, before you contribute to any conversation or meeting, what would I gain by speaking here, and what would I gain by listening? The honest answer, most of the time, is that you would gain more by listening. Listening gives you information about what the other people in the room know, believe, want, fear, and don't know they're revealing. Speaking, most of the time, gives you a momentary sense of being seen and heard and burns some of the social capital you could have been investing. Strategic listening also involves quality of attention, specifically, attending not just to what people say, but to how they say it, what they choose to emphasize, what they conspicuously avoid, where their confidence wavers, and where it becomes performative rather than genuine. The information embedded in these second-order signals is often more valuable than the literal content of what's being communicated. The negotiator who is truly confident in their position doesn't usually feel the need to stress it repeatedly. The colleague who is genuinely certain about a piece of analysis doesn't typically hedge it with excessive qualifications, and the person who is performing certainty, who needs you to believe they're confident even though they're not, almost always reveals that performance to a sufficiently attentive observer. The second principle is what we might call the management of your own visibility, a more dynamic and strategic version of the traditional advice to pick your battles. The question is not just which arguments to engage with, but how often and in what circumstances to be the most visible, most vocal, most active presence in a given environment. Most high-achieving people are habitually over-visible. They contribute in every meeting, because contributing in every meeting feels like engagement, and engagement feels like competence. They offer opinions on every subject because they have opinions on every subject, and offering them feels natural and honest and like the kind of transparent, high-integrity behavior they value. The problem is that habitual high visibility creates habitual predictability. When you contribute in every meeting, people stop valuing your contributions, not because they've decreased in quality, but because they've lost the scarcity premium. Like any resource that's abundant, your contributions become something people expect rather than something they value. The colleague who speaks in every meeting becomes part of the ambient noise of organizational life. The colleague who speaks rarely and precisely becomes someone whose contribution, when it comes, changes the direction of the discussion. This doesn't mean you should contribute rarely. It means you should contribute precisely and let your history of precision speak louder than any individual act of visibility. Over time, the person who has built a reputation for saying things worth listening to accumulates a form of authority that no amount of frequent, eager contribution can match. People begin to wait for them. They begin to attribute to them a depth and deliberateness, a sense of careful thought operating beneath the visible surface, that makes them more influential, not less, when they do choose to speak. The third principle is the deliberate and systematic giving away of credit. This is, for most ambitious people, the most psychologically difficult principle in this entire framework. We have been trained by school systems that award individual grades, by professional cultures that evaluate individual contribution, by social media environments that quantify individual attention, to think of credit as a zero-sum resource that must be captured and held. Giving credit away feels like giving up something real, and in the very short term, it is. The person who allows a colleague to present an idea they helped develop will not receive the recognition for that idea in that meeting. Full stop. But here is what happens over the medium and long term. The person who regularly, genuinely, and ungrudgingly gives credit to others builds a reputation that is vastly more powerful than any collection of individual credited achievements. They are seen as collaborative, generous, and fundamentally unthreatening, and these qualities paradoxically make them trusted with more responsibility, more access, and more real influence than the person who fiercely guards every credit and every recognition. People want to work with them. People want to share information with them. People want to succeed in their presence because their presence doesn't come with the implicit cost of having your contribution absorbed or minimized. There is also a purely practical dimension to this. The person who gives away credit for good ideas is frequently the person who generates good ideas most prolifically and can afford to give them away because there will always be more. The person who defends their ideas fiercely has often invested so much ego in those particular ideas that they can't release them, can't build on them freely, can't acknowledge when the idea needs to be modified or abandoned. The generous giver of credit is free from this trap in a way that the vigilant defender of recognition can never quite be. The fourth principle is patience, not as a passive quality, but as an active discipline. Specifically, the discipline of waiting for the right moment rather than acting at the first available moment. This runs profoundly against the urgency that characterizes most professional environments. We are surrounded by incentives to act quickly, to show responsiveness, to demonstrate that we're on top of things. The person who waits, who pauses, who takes time, who defers action while the situation continues to develop, often appears in the short term to be slow or passive or insufficiently engaged. But consider what waiting actually does. It allows a situation to reveal itself more completely before you commit to a response. It lets other people make their moves and reveal their strategies, their limits, and their mistakes before you've shown yours. It creates the possibility of acting with full information rather than partial information at a moment of your choosing rather than at a moment forced upon you by the urgency of others. And it builds, in the perception of those around you, a sense that your actions are deliberate, that when you do move, it's because you've seen something they haven't, because you've identified the right moment with a precision that seems almost uncanny to those who've been watching you wait. The legendary investor Warren Buffett, who is, by any measure, one of the most effective practitioners of the long-game thinking we've been describing, has often said that the most important thing in investing is not intelligence or information, but temperament. Specifically, the temperament to do nothing when doing nothing is the correct strategy, to resist the social and psychological pressure to act simply because action feels more productive than patience. The stock market is a device for transferring money from the impatient to the patient, he has said. This is a description of financial markets, but it's also a description of every social, professional, and organizational environment in which human beings compete for position and influence. The fifth and final principle is what we might call integrity of restraint, the commitment to maintaining your strategic invisibility even when it is personally costly, even when the temptation to demonstrate your full capability is overwhelming, even when you have clearly earned the right to be seen and recognized and celebrated. This is the hardest one. And it's hard, not because it requires you to be small or to suppress yourself, but because it requires you to hold a vision of your own power that is more sophisticated and more patient than the visions most people around you are operating from. It requires you to understand at a very deep level that the greatest demonstration of capability is often the most invisible one. that the best evidence of your intelligence is not the brilliance of your most public moments, but the quality of the outcomes you've shaped over time, often through dozens of barely visible interventions that no individual observer could piece together into a complete picture. Think of the architect, the actual, literal architect, the one who designs buildings. Their greatest work is invisible by definition. You see the building. You don't see the thousand decisions that preceded it, the structural calculations, the material choices, the spatial logic, the anticipation of how people will move through and experience the space over decades. The architect's intelligence is embedded in the outcome, not displayed in the process. And yet buildings that achieve great things, that work beautifully, that age well, that serve the people who inhabit them across generations, are monuments to a quality of thinking that no single impressive presentation could have communicated. The silent architect works the same way. Their intelligence is in the outcomes, in the organizations that function more effectively because of their presence, in the decisions that were made better because they asked the right question at the right moment, in the conflicts that never escalated because they created the conditions for resolution before either side had fully committed to a fight. You might spend years in the company of a genuine silent architect and never quite be able to put your finger on what makes them so valuable. You would simply notice over time that things go better when they're in the room. This is not a coincidence. It is the result of years of deliberate practice of exactly the principles we've been discussing, principles that are available to anyone who is willing to do the difficult psychological work of releasing the need for immediate recognition and operating instead from a longer, quieter, more powerful vision of what influence actually looks like. Let us return, at the end, to Arthur Schopenhauer, because his contribution to this framework is often misunderstood, and it's worth getting right. Schopenhauer was not arguing that intelligence should be hidden because it's dangerous or because other people can't handle it. He was not making a cynical argument about the stupidity of crowds or the futility of genuine intellectual engagement. He was making a much more specific and much more practical observation, that the desire to be recognized as intelligent is, in almost every circumstance, a less effective path to genuine influence than the patient, disciplined practice of being genuinely useful. There is a difference, fundamental, consequential, and easy to miss, between wanting to be seen as intelligent and wanting to be effective. The person who wants to be seen as intelligent will shape their behavior around what produces the impression of intelligence. They will speak when speaking makes them look smart. They will withhold contributions when withholding makes them look modest in exactly the right way. They will choose their battles based on where they can most visibly win and concede the ones where they can't without too much damage to their apparent superiority. The person who wants to be effective will shape their behavior around what actually produces results. They will speak when speaking is necessary and useful. They will listen when listening gives them what they need to act well. They will give credit away freely, because free-given credit is a social investment that generates long-term returns that dwarf the short-term cost. They will appear to lose arguments they actually win, because the argument was never the point. The outcome was the point, and the outcome is better served by allowing the other person to feel they won. This is the difference between performing power and exercising it, and it is, at the end of all this analysis, quite a simple distinction. Even if it is profoundly difficult to act on consistently in a world that rewards performance so visibly and effortlessly, and that asks so little of us, so rarely, in the way of actual exercise. The world is full of loud, visible, apparently powerful people who are working very hard to maintain an impression. Behind them, sometimes literally, often metaphorically, are the silent architects, the people who shape outcomes, who hold the real threads, who have traded the pleasure of being seen for the power of being indispensable. You have met them. You may not have recognized them. That's the whole point. And if this entire exploration of invisible power has left you with one thing, one idea that clarifies something, you've been dimly sensing but couldn't quite articulate, let it be this: real power doesn't ask for your attention. It doesn't need your applause. It doesn't raise its voice or pound the table or demand to be acknowledged. It simply shapes the world, quietly, from the places you're not watching, in the moments you're not paying attention, through the decisions you make while believing you're making them yourself. And somewhere, right now, in a glass-walled boardroom in Singapore, or a mediation room in Tokyo, or a government ministry in Helsinki, or 1,000 other places you'll never see, a silent architect is sitting quietly, listening carefully, and building something that will last, in ways that nobody in the room will fully understand until long after the building is complete. That is the art. That is the power. And now, at least in principle, it is yours to practice.